The storm was closing in, and so was she. On my surveillance screen, I watched Patricia Thornton pick her way across my snow-dusted land, the beam of her flashlight slicing through the blizzard as she made straight for my storm cellar. She had no clue I was observing. Every step she took was unaware that the entrance she planned to breach had a locking mechanism she couldn't defeat, and absolutely no idea her fixation on dominating my property was about to become her personal catastrophe. For 8 months, this homeowner association chairwoman had exhausted every bureaucratic maneuver to drive me from my own land. But tonight, frantic to uncover anything she could weaponize against me, she'd crossed a threshold with no return. Sometimes justice doesn't require a champion. It just needs someone foolish enough to step into their own snare. But I'm running ahead. Let me rewind to how this night began, before Patricia made the error that would unravel everything she'd spent 7 years constructing. My name is Clayton Booth, 43 years old, and what you might term a professional witness. 2 decades studying heirloom plant species taught me patience and meticulous record-keeping. Watch closely. Document everything. Never intervene until you possess complete information. That discipline served me well in botanical research. It would serve me even better tonight. I inherited this home from my grandfather 3 years ago. It sits on 5 acres of pine woodland, about 3 miles outside the township. The parcel predated the Pinecrest Meadows HOA, which legally meant their regulations did not apply to me. Legal realities rarely deter people convinced they own the world. The cellar sat 50 meters behind the main house. A Cold War-era shelter with poured concrete walls and a heavy steel door. 6 months ago, I installed a modern electronic lock on the inner door, the kind that connects to a smartphone and logs every access attempt. At the time, I told myself it was simple prudence. Now I recognize I'd been preparing for precisely this moment. The storm struck around 5 that December afternoon. I stood at my study window, watching the sky darken from slate to pitch, wind whipping the pines until they bent like stools. Snow fell so thickly I could scarcely see the tree line. Forecasts called it the worst blizzard in 15 years. My grandfather used to say, "Storms reveal character. A calm day lets folks pretend they're civil. A storm shows you who they truly are." I settled into my desk chair around 6, more from habit than necessity, monitoring the security feeds on my computer display. 4 cameras covered different views of the house and grounds. I'd installed them 8 months prior, after my first genuine clash with Patricia, when I realized documentation might become crucial. The cameras featured night vision and motion detection, professional grade. $3,000 well spent. I pulled up the cellar feed out of routine, checking the status indicator. Door locked, battery 87%. Last access 14 days ago. All normal. That's when I saw the light. 6:15 p.m., just a flicker at first, barely visible through the swirling snow. I leaned forward. There it was again. A beam moving low to the ground, sweeping side to side like someone searching. The motion sensor outlined it in a red box. Someone was out there in this tempest, on my land, advancing toward the cellar. I didn't hurry or panic. I simply watched, letting the camera record. Never interrupt an organism in its natural behavior. You learn more by observing than interfering. The figure moved deliberately, staying low, glancing back toward my house every few seconds. Even through the degraded image quality, I could discern clear intent. This wasn't someone lost. This was someone who knew exactly their destination and didn't wish to be seen. They reached the cellar entrance at 6:21. The camera showed them from above, hood up, back to the lens. They set down a small pack and knelt by the outer door, hands working with purpose. After a moment, I understood. They were manipulating the old mechanical lock, the original hardware my grandfather had installed. That lock was mostly ornamental now, corroded and weak. It wouldn't deter anyone determined. I sat back and took a slow sip of coffee. My pulse stayed steady. My hands didn't tremble. I felt something cold, clear, and patient. This was the moment every camera, every log, every careful chronicle of Patricia's harassment had readied me for. Someone foolish enough to commit a crime I could substantiate. I didn't know for certain it was Patricia yet, though the build and movement suggested it. But I didn't require certainty. I just required evidence. My cameras were recording everything in high definition, time-stamped, backed up to 3 separate drives. I opened my phone and called up the cellar lock application. The interface showed locked, charged, undisturbed, but it also offered control options. I could unlock it remotely, change the access code, or activate override mode, which disabled all mechanisms until I manually reset it. I stared at that last option, weighing the implications. Then I set the phone down. Not yet. Let her get inside first. Let her commit fully. The best traps don't spring until the prey is wholly invested. Outside, the wind howled louder. Snow piled against the window panes. Power flickered, but held. On my monitor, the figure worked steadily at my cellar door. I couldn't hear anything over the game, but the camera captured everything. At 6:23, the outer door gave way. Aged metal yielding to a crowbar or picks or sheer determination. The figure grabbed their pack and slipped inside, pulling the steel door shut behind them. That's when I permitted myself a thin smile, because that outer door featured a self-locking bolt that engaged automatically when closed from the inside. My grandfather had installed it during the Cold War to protect those taking shelter. Now it served a different purpose. The person in my root cellar had locked themselves into a space with only one other exit, an electronic door they couldn't open, inside a concrete bunker that blocked all cellular signals. Trapped, and didn't even realize it yet. I picked up my phone again, navigating my contacts. The county sheriff's non-emergency line was saved, stored months ago for just such an event. Next to it, my attorney Desmond Archer's cell number. I didn't call either yet. First, I wanted to see what transpired next, gather every frame of evidence, and construct an utterly airtight case. Patricia Thornton, if that was indeed who stood in my cellar attempting to breach my property, was about to teach the entire community what happens when you mistake patience for frailty. I set my coffee down and leaned back, watching the monitor. On screen, the figure stood in the narrow passage between doors. A flashlight beam probing the electronic lock, confined in a concrete coffin of their own making. All I had to do was wait. If someone had asked me that morning what I'd be doing tonight, I would have said reading, perhaps organizing seed catalogs, planning next spring's garden. Instead, I was watching someone commit felonies against my property while a blizzard raged outside. And the strangest part, I felt completely calm, not enraged, not fearful, not even startled, just prepared. Because limits matter. Property rights matter. When someone decides those concepts don't apply to them, when they decide their authority overrides your autonomy, someone must demonstrate they are mistaken, not with violence or fury, but with evidence, procedure, and the patient application of law. My monitor glowed in the darkening room. The storm hammered the windows. And somewhere in a bunker 50 meters away, Patricia Thornton was about to learn the most costly lesson of her life. I pulled up the lock cap once more and hovered my finger over the override button. Not yet, but soon. To comprehend why Patricia Thornton was breaking into my storm cellar during a blizzard, you must understand what occurs when someone constructs their entire identity around control, and then encounters someone who will not be controlled. 10 months ago, she knocked on my door with a clipboard and a smile that didn't touch her eyes. I'd moved back to my grandfather's house just 3 weeks earlier, still unpacking cartons. Patricia introduced herself as the Pinecrest Meadows HOA chairwoman, a position she'd held for 7 years. She congratulated me on inheriting such a charming property, then handed me a printed list of 12 violations requiring immediate correction. Paint color, fence height, trash bin placement, mailbox style, single-spaced, professionally formatted. I read it twice while she waited on my porch, smile unwavering. When I finished, I explained politely that my property predated the HOA's establishment in 1987. According to county archives and the original subdivision plat, my land sat outside their jurisdiction. I wasn't subject to their regulations. Her smile finally slipped. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from Morrison & Associates, the legal firm representing the HOA. It demanded I trim trees, repaint the house, and relocate the woot cellar, which they alleged was an unpermitted structure creating liability issues. Professional but menacing, full of phrases like immediate compliance, legal action, and property liens. I spent 8 hours crafting a response, 8 pages citing Colorado's grandfathering clauses, property rights statutes, and historical preservation laws. I attached building permits from 1942, property surveys, and boundary documentation proving my parcel fell outside HOA jurisdiction. I sent copies to Morrison & Associates, the county assessor, and Patricia personally. Then came 6 weeks of silence. I thought perhaps facts had settled the matter. I should have known better. Patricia hadn't spent 7 years dominating a homeowner association by accepting defeat gracefully. If the law wouldn't grant her power over my property, she'd find another avenue. She went digital. A neighborhood forum appeared online titled, "Protect Our Community Values." Patricia created it, moderated it, seeded it with posts about property upkeep and neighborhood standards. Then came photographs of my house taken from the street, posted with captions about neglect and declining home values. The house wasn't neglected. Original paint, but well-maintained. Yard tidy, everything functional. But Patricia framed it as blight, as one property dragging down the entire area. Some neighbors joined in, people who had never spoken to me, who knew nothing of boundary disputes, who simply believed her posts. Others pushed back, demanding proof. The group fractured into factions. Arguments erupted. Through it all, Patricia positioned herself as the reasonable voice safeguarding everyone's investments. I didn't engage publicly. I documented everything: screenshots, timestamps, filed systematically, building a record, my attorney said, provided clear grounds for defamation. But legal action felt premature, reactive. I wanted to see how far she'd press before revealing my hand. The answer came at the monthly HOA assembly in November, 1 month ago. Patricia placed a special proposal on the agenda to expand HOA jurisdiction to include historically excluded properties. My property specifically, though she never spoke my name. She presented it as protecting property values, ensuring consistent standards, bringing outlier parcels into proper governance. 40 residents attended. I was among them. I sat in the rear and let Patricia deliver her entire presentation. 15 minutes of carefully prepared arguments about community cohesion, legal precedents, and modern property management. Slides, graphs, memorized talking points. When she finished, the HOA board opened the floor for discussion. I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't attack her personally. I simply presented facts. Original property maps, grandfathering protections under state law, specific statutes preventing retroactive jurisdiction expansion. Point by point, I demonstrated her proposal was legally impossible, and attempting it would expose the HOA to liability. I spoke for 10 minutes. When I concluded, the room was silent. The vote wasn't close. 31 residents against, 9 in favor. The board chair thanked everyone and moved to the next item. Patricia gathered her materials with trembling hands and left before adjournment. I stayed until the meeting ended, then walked to my truck. She was waiting beside my driver's door in the November chill. Her expression shifted from professional to something harder, something personal. She said, "You think you're clever. You think you've won." Then she leaned closer and said she'd prove I was violating something, even if she had to uncover the proof herself. I looked at her calmly and said trespassing on private property was a criminal offense. She laughed and walked away. I drove home that night, contemplating escalation, about how conflicts intensify when one side cannot accept loss. Patricia had tried legal pressure and failed. Social pressure failed. Political maneuvering failed. What came next? I didn't know precisely, but I knew enough to prepare. The next morning, I upgraded my security system. 2 additional cameras with night vision focused on the cellar and property perimeter. Motion sensors, remote monitoring, cloud backup. 3 weeks later, I upgraded the cellar's antiquated mechanical lock to a modern electronic system with phone controls and access logs. The locksmith called it overkill for a storage bunker. I said I preferred overkill to regret. Now watching my monitor as someone worked on breaching that bunker, I understood preparation wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. Patricia had signaled exactly what she'd do, told me directly she'd find evidence herself. And here she was, in the worst storm in 15 years, committing burglary to prove I was somehow the problem. I never sought this conflict. But when someone decides your boundaries don't matter and your rights don't count, you face 2 choices: yield and let them prevail, or hold your ground and make them face repercussions. I'd spent 8 months choosing patience over confrontation, documentation over anger, legal process over emotional reaction. Tonight, that patience would yield returns. The best defense isn't aggression. It's being so thoroughly prepared that your opponent defeats themselves. The figure in my root cellar had been confined for exactly 7 minutes when I decided to continue watching instead of summoning help. That probably sounds cold, perhaps even cruel. But let me be unequivocal. I wasn't keeping her locked in there to punish her. I was documenting a crime in progress, amassing evidence admissible in court, ensuring that when law enforcement arrived, there would be zero ambiguity about what transpired tonight. The distinction matters. One is vengeance, the other is justice. I've never been interested in vengeance. On my monitor, the figure stood in the narrow corridor between the outer and inner doors, a flashlight beam moving across the electronic lock's keypad. Even through the camera's night vision filter, I could perceive frustration in her posture. Shoulders punched, head tilting, hand reaching out to test the keyboard, then withdrawing. She was problem-solving, trying to comprehend why a root cellar would possess a modern security system. The camera was positioned in the upper corner of the corridor, concealed behind a ventilation grate I'd installed specifically for surveillance. From her vantage, it would be invisible. She had no idea she was being recorded in high definition, every movement time-stamped and backed up. I pulled my notebook closer and began logging observations. 7:03 p.m. Subject attempts to manipulate outer door handle. No success. Mechanism is self-locked. 7:05. Subject examines electronic keypad. Appears to be considering code entry. 7:07. Subject tries several combinations. The lock's app sent me notifications with each failed attempt. First try, 1 2 3 4. Second, 0 0 0 0. Third, 1987, the year the HOA was founded. I nearly chuckled at that last one. Even breaking into my property, she couldn't stop thinking about her precious organization. The fifth failed attempt triggered the lock's security protocol. A 10-minute lockdown, the screen flashing red. I watched her step back, presumably seeing that warning light, realizing she'd worsened her situation. The storm outside intensified. Wind rattled my windows hard enough that I glanced from the monitor to check the weather radar on my phone. The blizzard's core sat directly over our area, not moving, just dumping snow in waves. Visibility near zero, roads impassable, emergency services stretched thin. Perfect conditions for someone to believe they could commit a crime undetected. Perfect conditions for that same person to recognize they'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. I looked back at the monitor. The figure had sat on the corridor steps, back against the inner door, flashlight resting beside her. From this angle, I could discern more detail. A dark winter coat, boots that appeared expensive, leather gloves. The hood had fallen back slightly, revealing blonde hair. I zoomed in as far as the camera allowed. Even with degraded resolution, I recognized her. No question now. The HOA chairwoman herself, sitting in my root cellar, ensnared by her own choices. I should have felt triumphant. 8 months of harassment, legal threats, social media attacks, all culminating in this moment where she'd finally crossed a line that couldn't be erased. But triumph wasn't what I felt. Mostly, I felt weary. Weary of conflict. Weary of having to prove repeatedly that I possessed rights she couldn't override. Weary of being forced into defensive postures by someone who refused to accept a simple truth. My property wasn't hers to command. That's all this ever was. A boundary dispute where one side understood legal reality and the other believed authority trumped law. Now here we were, her confined in concrete, me observing from warmth and safety, both of us waiting to see what happened next. I opened my phone and called up the sheriff's non-emergency contact again. My thumb hovered over the call button. One tap and this entire situation would shift into official channels. Officers would respond, even in this storm, because someone trapped in a confined space qualified as a potential emergency. They'd arrive, document the scene, hear my account, review my camera footage. They'd see exactly what I saw. A clear case of criminal trespass, attempted burglary, destruction of property, open and shut. But something made me pause. If I called now, the narrative would be simple. Woman breaks in, gets trapped, owner calls police. Clean but unremarkable. If I waited, if I let her experience the full weight of her actions, if I gave her time to comprehend that I held every card and she held none, the lesson might actually take root, not just for her, but for everyone who had watched her campaign against me, everyone who'd believed her version of events. 7:20 p.m. I made a decision. I activated the intercom system I'd installed in the cellar 3 months earlier, originally intended for emergencies if I were ever injured while working below. The speaker sat in the ceiling near the camera, small and inconspicuous. I unmuted my microphone and spoke, keeping my tone level and calm. I said her full name. I said I knew she was in my root cellar. On the monitor, she jolted as if electrocuted. Flashlight clattering to the floor, head whipping around, trying to locate the source of my voice. I waited for her to settle, watching her breath plume in visible puffs in the cold air. Then I continued. I explained I'd been watching her since she entered my property. I had video of her forcing the outer lock. I had logs of her attempts to crack the electronic system. She was currently trespassing on private land and attempting to burglarize a secured structure. Her response came fast and loud, voice echoing in the concrete space. She demanded I open the door immediately, accused me of setting a trap, called this illegal imprisonment. I listened without interrupting, letting her expend her anger against the walls. When she finished, I replied with facts. I hadn't trapped her. She'd trapped herself by entering my property without permission and closing a self-locking door behind her. I hadn't imprisoned her. I'd simply declined to assist someone actively committing crimes against me, and I would open the door, absolutely, as soon as law enforcement arrived to document her actions. She fell silent for a long moment. Then she tried a different approach, apologetic, conciliatory, saying this was all a misunderstanding. She just wanted to check on something. We could resolve this privately. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost, because this was precisely how she'd operated for 8 months. Aggressive until confronted, then immediately pivoting to reasonable explanations and private negotiations, trying to evade consequences by reframing criminal behavior as simple miscommunication. I told her no. No private negotiations. No working it out. No pretending this was anything other than what it was. She'd threatened to find evidence against me, even if she had to do it herself. Now she'd followed through on that threat, and she'd face exactly the consequences that threat warranted. She started yelling again, but I muted the intercom. I'd said what needed saying. Now came the waiting. I sat back in my chair and checked the time. 7:25 p.m. I'd give it another 20 minutes. Let the reality of her situation truly sink in. Let her cycle through anger and bargaining, and perhaps approach genuine apprehension. Then I'd make the call, not to help her, but to ensure everything that followed was documented, legal, and utterly unassailable in court. The storm continued its assault on my windows. Snow piled higher against the glass. My study felt warm and secure, insulated from the chaos outside. On my monitor, a figure in the cellar had ceased moving, just sitting hunched on the steps, flashlight beam pointed at nothing. The temperature down there was likely around 50 degrees, chilly but not hazardous. She had shelter from the wind, a dry space, no immediate physical threat. She was safer than she deserved to be, honestly. I pulled up my contact list once more, scrolling past the sheriff to my attorney's number. I sent him a text. Situation developing. Need you on standby. Will call within the hour. He replied almost immediately. Standing by. Don't do anything without me on the line. Good advice. Desmond had kept me clear of trouble for 3 years, always advocating patience over reaction, documentation over confrontation. Tonight would validate every cautious decision we'd made. 7:40 p.m. 15 minutes since I'd spoken to her through the intercom. Enough time. I unmuted my microphone again and informed her I was calling the county sheriff now to report a trespassing in progress. She could cooperate when they arrived or make things more difficult for herself. Her choice entirely. Then I muted her response and dialed. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, professional and calm, despite the storm chaos she was likely managing. I identified myself, gave my address, explained the situation in clear, factual terms. Someone had broken into my property's storage structure and was currently confined inside. I had video evidence of the break-in. The individual was not injured, but unable to exit without my assistance. I was requesting an officer to document the situation before I released her. The dispatcher asked if the person posed any danger. I said no. Asked if I felt threatened. I said no. Asked if I could maintain the current situation until an officer arrived. I said absolutely. She told me response time would be 45 minutes to an hour given weather conditions. I said I'd wait. She said an officer would call when en route. I thanked her and disconnected. Done. Officially recorded. No going back now. I looked at my monitor one last time before settling in to wait. The figure in the cellar hadn't moved. Just sitting there in the cold and dark, finally comprehending that some lines, once crossed, change everything. I tried to tell her that a month ago in the parking lot. She'd laughed. She wasn't laughing now. The dispatcher called back at 8:07 p.m. An officer was en route. Estimated arrival in 30 minutes. I acknowledged and hung up, then returned my attention to the monitor. In the 40 minutes since I called the sheriff, the woman in my cellar had undergone what appeared to be several distinct emotional phases. First came denial, pacing the small corridor, testing both doors repeatedly as if the locks might magically disengage. Then anger, shouting at the ceiling, at the camera she still hadn't located. Then bargaining, her voice going soft and reasonable through the intercom I'd muted. Now she'd reached something closer to acceptance, sitting motionless on the steps, conserving body heat, waiting. Good. Clear thinking would make this easier when the officer arrived. I zoomed the camera in slightly, studying her posture and the items scattered near her feet. The backpack she'd brought sat open beside her, contents partially visible. I could make out what looked like a compact camera, the kind used for home inspection videos, a notepad and pen, a measuring tape, the crowbar she'd used on the outer lock. She'd come prepared for documentation, for gathering evidence she could weaponize against me in some future HOA proceeding. The plan was obvious in retrospect. Break in during the storm, when I'd presumably be distracted or unable to check the property. Document whatever she could find in the cellar, real violations or manufactured ones. Return home before anyone noticed, then present her findings at the next board meeting as proof I was storing hazardous materials or violating safety codes, or whatever narrative she'd constructed to justify her authority. Except she'd miscalculated on every single point. She didn't know I'd been watching from the moment she stepped onto my land. Didn't know the cellar held nothing but legitimate storage, seed collections, gardening equipment, old family furniture. Didn't know the door mechanisms would trap her, and definitely didn't know I'd prioritize legal process over her comfort. Her entire plan depended on me being either oblivious or passive. She'd spent 8 months observing me respond to her provocations with patience and documentation. Somehow she'd interpreted that patience as weakness rather than strategy. That misreading was about to cost her everything she'd built. The temperature in the corridor had likely dropped to around 45 degrees by now. Cold enough to be uncomfortable, not cold enough to be dangerous. She'd pulled her coat tighter, hood back up, arms wrapped around herself. Her breath plumed visibly. The flashlight beside her was dimming, battery draining after nearly 2 hours of continuous use. Soon she'd be sitting in near total darkness, save for the faint glow of the electronic lock's error message. I wondered if she'd started to understand yet, truly understand, that this wasn't a temporary inconvenience, but a permanent turning point. In her desperation to prove she held power over me, she'd committed felonies that would strip away the actual power she did possess. I thought back to our first meeting, her standing on my porch with that clipboard and manufactured smile. She'd been so confident then, so certain her title and her rules granted her dominion over everything within her perceived territory. 7 years as HOA chairwoman had taught her that most people fold when confronted with official-looking documents and threats of fines. She'd learned the wrong lesson. She'd learned that authority works through intimidation, that people comply to avoid conflict, that persistence overcomes resistance. What she'd never learned was what happens when you encounter someone who actually comprehends the law, who documents everything, who won't be intimidated because they know precisely where your authority ends and their rights begin. She'd been governing a community of people who mostly just wanted quiet lives and didn't want trouble. Then I moved in. Someone who had spent 20 years in academic research, where challenging assumptions and demanding evidence wasn't confrontational. It was basic methodology. 8:20 p.m., 10 minutes until the officer's arrival. I checked the weather radar again. The storm was finally starting to shift east, intensity dropping slightly. Roads would still be terrible, but at least visibility was improving. I heard an engine outside, a low rumble cutting through the wind. Headlights wept across my window. Right on schedule. I stood and grabbed my coat, then paused at the door. One more check of my phone, ensuring I had the video files queued and ready to share. Lock system logs downloaded and saved. Timeline documented. Everything organized and accessible. Then I headed downstairs. The deputy's vehicle sat in my driveway. Lights still running. Exhaust puffing white in the cold. I opened my front door as he climbed out. A tall man in his early 50s, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd worked too many winter accident calls. I recognized him immediately. The same officer who'd responded to a noise complaint near my property 6 months ago. Unrelated to any of this, but we'd spoken briefly. He recognized me too, nodding as he approached. We shook hands on the porch. I thanked him for coming out in this weather. He said it was the job, then asked for my account of the situation. I laid it out chronologically and factually. Noticed suspicious activity on my security cameras at 6:15 p.m. Observed an individual approaching my root cellar with tools. Watched them force the mechanical lock on the outer door and enter the structure. Explained the door's self-locking mechanism and the electronic lock on the inner door. Described how the individual became trapped when both systems engaged. Noted I'd made verbal contact via intercom to confirm identity and intent. Then called the sheriff's office to request an official response before releasing her. The deputy took notes, asking clarifying questions. How long has she been confined? About 2 hours. Was she injured? Not to my knowledge. Did I know who she was? Yes. Did I wish to press charges? Absolutely. He asked to see the video footage. I pulled out my phone and showed him the relevant clips. Her approach through the snow, kneeling at the outer door with tools, forcing the lock, entering the corridor, closing the door behind her, attempting codes on the electronic system. All of it clear, time-stamped, undeniable. The deputy watched without expression, then asked if I had the full recording available. I said it was saved on my computer inside, along with system logs showing precisely when each lock engaged and every failed access attempt. He nodded slowly, processing the implications. Then he asked where the cellar was located. I led him around the house, both of us trudging through snow, already 8 inches deep and still falling. The cellar entrance sat at the base of a gentle slope, the heavy steel door barely visible under accumulated drift. The deputy swept his flashlight across it, examining the damaged lock mechanism hanging loose where she'd forced it. He knelt, studying the tool marks, the bent metal, straightforward breaking and entering. He stood and brushed snow from his knees, then asked if I was certain I wished to proceed with charges. I looked at him directly and said I'd warned her a month ago that trespassing was a criminal offense. She'd done it anyway. Actions have consequences. He made a call on his radio, requesting a second unit and medical response as a precaution. Dispatch confirmed both were en route. Another 20 minutes, given conditions. We walked back to my house to wait. In my study, I showed him the full security system setup, the multiple camera angles, the cloud backup, the detailed logs. He reviewed everything methodically, occasionally making notes. When he finished, he asked how long I'd maintained this level of surveillance. I explained the timeline, the escalating conflict with the HOA chairwoman, her explicit threat to find evidence against me personally, my decision to document everything in case she followed through. He asked if the person in my cellar was indeed the HOA chairwoman. I confirmed it was. The deputy sat back, rubbing his jaw. He said this would generate significant community tension. I said the community deserved to know their chairwoman was willing to commit crimes to maintain power. He didn't disagree. Another set of headlights appeared outside, followed shortly by a third vehicle. The backup unit and medical response arriving together. The deputy stood and suggested we handle the extraction now that everyone was present. I grabbed my phone, pulled up the lock control app, and followed him outside. 4 people stood at my cellar door when we arrived. 2 deputies, both looking cold and annoyed at being called out in a blizzard. 2 paramedics with a medical bag and thermal blankets. The first deputy briefed them quickly. Individual confined inside approximately 2 hours. Not injured, but possibly hypothermic. Situation is criminal trespass. One paramedic asked if we were certain about her condition. I held up my phone and showed him the live camera feed. She was sitting upright, moving normally. No signs of distress beyond cold and anger. He nodded. The first deputy positioned himself at the door, hand near his belt. The second deputy stood to the side with a camera to document the extraction. The paramedics readied their equipment. Everyone looked at me. I opened the lock app, navigated to the override controls, and disabled the manual lock mode. The electronic system beeped once. Then I selected unlock. The mechanism clicked loudly in the quiet storm. The deputy pulled the inner door open. She emerged fast, pushing past the deputy, stumbling in the snow. For a moment, I thought she might run. Then she saw the uniforms, the vehicles, the official response, and stopped. Her face shifted from rage to confusion to something approaching horror. She opened her mouth to speak, likely to demand my arrest or claim false imprisonment or spin some version casting herself as the victim. The first deputy held up his hand. He identified himself and advised her she had the right to remain silent, that anything she said could be used as evidence, that she had the right to an attorney. Standard Miranda warnings delivered in a flat, professional tone, while snow fell around us and my security cameras recorded everything. This wasn't negotiable anymore. This wasn't a private dispute or a community disagreement. This was law enforcement conducting a criminal investigation, and she was the subject. One paramedic approached with a thermal blanket. She took it automatically, wrapping it around her shoulders, while the deputy continued explaining her rights. She wasn't listening. She was staring at me, standing 10 feet away near my cellar door. I held her gaze, expression neutral. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just looked back at her the same way I'd looked at her a month ago when I said trespassing was a crime. The same way I'd looked at her during the HOA assembly when I dismantled her jurisdiction argument. Calm, factual, unmoved. She'd had every opportunity to de-escalate, every opportunity to accept that she didn't control my property. She'd chosen this path, step by step, decision by decision. Now she stood in my yard, surrounded by police, wrapped in an emergency blanket, about to be charged with felonies. And I felt nothing but the cold certainty that justice, real justice, doesn't require emotion. It just requires patience and evidence, and letting people face the natural repercussions of their own conduct. The second deputy began photographing the scene, while the first continued processing her rights. I watched from my position near the cellar entrance, cans in my coat pockets, breathing steady clouds of vapor into the cold air. She'd stopped trying to speak, just stood there wrapped in the thermal blanket. Mascara streaked down her cheeks from tears or melted snow or both. One paramedic checked her vital signs, asking about numbness or dizziness. She answered in monosyllables, eyes never leaving my face. I recognized that look. Disbelief mixing with rage. The expression of someone realizing they've miscalculated so profoundly that the damage can't be undone. The first deputy finished the Miranda warning and asked if she understood her rights as explained. She nodded once. He asked if she was willing to answer questions. She opened her mouth, closed it, then said she wanted a lawyer. Smart move. Probably the first smart decision she'd made all night. The deputy acknowledged her invitation and turned to his partner, exchanging brief words I couldn't hear over the wind. Then he approached me, notepad ready. He needed my formal statement for the report. I gave it to him the same way I'd given my initial account, chronologically, without embellishment. Observed suspicious activity, watched it develop into clear criminal trespass, documented everything, called for official response. The deputy asked if I wished to provide the video files now or later. I said now was fine. I'd already prepared copies. We moved back toward my house, the deputy following me inside, while his partner stayed with the subject and paramedics. In my study, I transferred the files to a thumb drive I'd prepared earlier, properly labeled with date and timestamps. The deputy examined my security setup with professional interest, asking about camera placement and recording duration. I explained the system stored footage for 90 days, rolling, motion activated to conserve space. He asked if all cameras were positioned on my property. I showed him the property survey, demonstrating every camera angle stayed within my legal boundaries. He nodded, satisfied. Everything I'd done was completely legal. The same couldn't be said for the woman standing outside in emergency blankets. The transfer completed. I handed him the drive, along with printed logs from the electronic lock system, showing every failed access attempt, with exact timestamps. The deputy reviewed the printout briefly, then looked up at me. He said most people would have simply opened the door and sent her away, avoiding the whole mess. I said most people weren't dealing with 8 months of systematic harassment and explicit threats to trespass. He asked if I had documentation of those threats. I did. I pulled out my phone and showed him the screenshots I'd taken of her social media posts, the text of the legal letters from the HOA attorney, and finally, the video clip from my truck's dash camera on the night she confronted me in the parking lot, the night she promised to find evidence herself. He watched that clip twice, listening to her voice through my phone speaker. When it finished, he handed the phone back and said, "You've built a solid case." The radio on his belt crackled. His partner requested assistance with transport. The deputy acknowledged, and we headed back outside. The scene had shifted in the few minutes I'd been inside. She was sitting in the back of the second patrol vehicle, door open, blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. The paramedics had cleared her medically. No signs of hypothermia or injury, beyond minor abrasions on her hands from working the locks. The first deputy stood nearby, filling out paperwork on a metal clipboard, occasionally glancing at his vehicle. When we approached, he looked up and asked if I'd provided the evidence files. His partner confirmed I had. The first deputy nodded, then turned to me directly. He said given the circumstances and the clear documentation, they'd be charging her with criminal trespass in the first degree and criminal mischief, possibly attempted burglary, depending on what the district attorney decided after reviewing the evidence. I asked what happened next. He explained she'd be transported to the county detention center for booking and initial processing. She'd already invoked her right to counsel, so no further questioning tonight. Bail would be set at her arraignment, probably within 48 hours. I'd receive notification about court dates and would likely be called to testify. Standard procedure for this type of case. I asked about the restraining order process. He said I could file for that separately through the county clerk. Given the documented pattern of harassment, it would likely be granted. I thanked him. He closed his notepad and walks to his vehicle. The second deputy stood and approached me while his partner secured the patrol car. He asked if I felt safe staying here tonight, if I was concerned about retaliation from her associates or family. I said no. Her authority derived from her position, not from personal connections or physical threat. Once that position was gone, she'd have nothing. He looked skeptical but didn't press. Instead, he handed me a case number card and said to call if anything else developed. Then, both vehicles pulled away slowly, tires crunching through fresh snow, red and blue lights fading into the storm. I stood in my driveway, watching until the lights disappeared completely. Then I turned and walked back to my house. Inside, I locked the door and stood in the entryway for a long moment, listening to the silence. The confrontation I'd been preparing for over 8 months had lasted less than 3 hours, from first observation to arrest. All that documentation, all that careful preparation, all those hours consulting with attorneys and upgrading security systems, it had functioned exactly as intended. Not because I wanted to harm anyone, not because I enjoyed seeing someone suffer repercussions, but because when you are pushed far enough by someone who won't respect basic limits, you must choose. Submit and validate their behavior, or stand firm and let the Lord do what it's designed to do. I'd chosen the latter. Now came the aftermath. I walked to my study and sat at the desk. The security monitors still displayed all 4 camera angles, though now they just showed empty, snow-covered property. I thought about shutting the system down, taking a break from surveillance. Then I remembered there would be a trial eventually, possibly civil suits, definitely community fallout. The cameras stayed on. I opened my email instead and drafted a message to my attorney. Situation resolved. Subject arrested. Full evidence package transferred to county sheriff. Attached copies of everything I'd given the deputies. Sent it with a high priority flag. He'd see it in the morning and probably call before 8 a.m. with questions and next steps. For now, my part was done. The storm had finally started to break. Through my window, I could see gaps in the clouds, stars visible between dark masses of weather. The wind still blew, but without the earlier fury. By morning, roads would be passable. Emergency crews would dig out. Life would return to normal, or whatever passed for normal, after tonight. I wondered what she was doing right now. Sitting in a holding cell somewhere. Probably still in shock at how completely her plan had collapsed. She'd thought she was clever, breaking in during a storm when I'd be distracted. She'd thought her position as HOA chairwoman granted her some immunity, or at least plausible deniability. She'd been mistaken on every count, but I didn't feel victorious. Vindicated? Perhaps. Validated, certainly, but not victorious. Victory implies a contest where both sides held equal standing. This wasn't that. This was a person with imagined authority running headlong into actual law and discovering that titles don't protect you from repercussions. She could have stopped at any point. After I showed her the property surveys, after I responded to the legal letters, after I presented facts at the HOA assembly, after I explicitly warned her trespassing was criminal. Instead, she'd escalated at every opportunity, each time choosing confrontation over acceptance, each time believing persistence would eventually wear me down. Now she'd learn what I tried to tell her from the start. Persistence without legal foundation is just harassment. And harassment, when you document it properly, becomes evidence. I checked my phone one last time before heading to bed. 3 missed calls from unknown numbers, probably neighbors who'd already heard something happened. I deal with those tomorrow. 1 text from my attorney, despite the late hour. Got your email. Well done. We'll talk in the morning. I sent back a simple acknowledgement and set the phone on my nightstand. Then I lay back and stared at the ceiling, listening to wind against the windows. Sleep would probably be difficult tonight. Adrenaline still coursing through my system, even though the crisis had passed. But eventually, my eyes grew heavy. The last thought I had before drifting off was about boundaries, about how some people spend their whole lives pushing against others' limits, testing to see what they can get away with, never quite understanding that limits exist for reasons. Property lines, legal jurisdiction, personal autonomy. These aren't suggestions. They're foundations of civil society. And when someone repeatedly violates those foundations, sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let them face the full weight of their actions. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Because some lessons can only be learned the hard way. The house settled around me, creaking in familiar ways. Outside, snow continued falling, softer now, covering the tracks and footprints and evidence of tonight's confrontation under fresh white layers. By morning, the yard would look peaceful again, unmarked. But the recordings would remain. The logs would remain. The charges would remain. And somewhere in a detention center, a woman who had spent 7 years believing she controlled everything in her domain was learning that control was always an illusion. The attorney called at 7:45 the next morning, exactly 15 minutes before I predicted. I answered on the second ring, phone pressed to my ear while I gazed out transformed landscape. The storm had deposited nearly 14 inches of snow overnight, burying my property under pristine white that glittered in weak morning sunlight. You'd never know someone had been arrested here 12 hours ago. Nature had erased all surface evidence, but digital evidence doesn't disappear with snowfall. My attorney's voice came through crisp and alert despite the early hour. He'd reviewed everything I sent, watched all the video files, read through the lock system logs and timeline documentation. His assessment was straightforward. I'd handled the situation perfectly from a legal standpoint. Clear trespass, clear documentation, proper notification to authorities, 0 physical confrontation. The district attorney would have no trouble prosecuting this case. Then he asked the question I'd been expecting. Did I understand the social consequences of what I'd done? Arresting the HOA chairwoman would create significant community division. Some would support me. Others would see me as vindictive. Was I prepared for that? I told him I'd been prepared since the moment I installed the security cameras. This wasn't about popularity or community standing. This was about establishing that property rights matter more than social pressure. He was quiet a moment, then said he'd represent me through whatever came next. We discussed practical next steps. I'd need to file for a restraining order that afternoon, which he'd help prepare. The arraignment would likely happen today or tomorrow, depending on court schedules. I should expect calls from neighbors and possibly media once word spread. Don't discuss the case with anyone except him. Standard advice, but important. We hung up with plans to meet at his office after lunch. The predicted calls started arriving around 9 a.m. First was a woman I recognized from the HOA assembly, someone who'd voted against the jurisdiction expansion. She wanted to know if rumors were true, if the chairwoman had really been arrested on my property. I kept my response brief. There had been an incident. Law enforcement had responded. I couldn't discuss details while the case was active. She understood, but added that plenty in the community had been waiting for someone to stand up to that woman's overreach. I thanked her and ended the call. 2 more came within the next hour, variations on the same theme. Is it true? What happened? Can you tell us anything? I gave the same non-answer each time. Then came a different type of call. A man identifying himself as an HOA board member demanded to know what charges I'd filed and threatened legal action for false imprisonment. I let him finish his entire speech before responding. I hadn't filed charges. I'd reported a crime in progress. Law enforcement had made the arrest decision based on evidence. If he had concerns about false imprisonment, he should direct them to the county sheriff's office, not me. And if he continued making threats, I'd add him to the restraining order I was filing that afternoon. He hung up without another word. I added his number to my call log anyway, just in case. Around 11 a.m., I received an email from the sheriff's office with an update. The subject had been arraigned that morning via video conference due to weather delays in the court system. Bail had been set at $5,000. She'd posted it and been released with conditions. No contact with me, no approaching my property, surrender of passport, agreement to appear at all scheduled hearings. The preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks out. I'd receive a formal subpoena to testify, but my presence wasn't required until then. The email included case numbers and contact information for the assigned deputy district attorney. I forwarded everything to my attorney and made a note to follow up on the restraining order. The community reaction accelerated through the afternoon. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages and calls. I eventually silenced it and focused on productive tasks. I drove to the county clerk's office through roads finally passable, filed the restraining order paperwork with my attorney's assistance, and provided additional documentation of the 8-month harassment pattern. The clerk said a judge would review it within 72 hours, likely approval given the criminal charges and documented threats. I'd be notified by mail. The whole process took 90 minutes. Clinical, bureaucratic. Exactly the kind of systematic approach that had served me well throughout this entire situation. On the drive home, I thought about what the deputy had said last night. Most people would have just opened the door and avoided the mess. He was probably right. Most people value peace over principle, prefer to let things slide rather than enforce boundaries. I understood that impulse. Confrontation is exhausting. Legal processes are slow and expensive. Social consequences can be severe. But there's a cost to always choosing peace. Every time you let someone violate your boundaries without repercussion, you teach them boundaries don't matter. You validate their belief persistence overcomes rights. Eventually, They push so far that the cost of stopping them exceeds the cost of standing firm from the start. I'd drawn my line early and held it consistently. Now, while the immediate situation felt chaotic, the foundation was solid. Back home, I made coffee and sat to review emails. One stood out immediately, sent from an address I didn't recognize, but with a subject line that caught my attention. HOA Leadership Transition. I opened it cautiously. The message came from someone identifying herself as a board member, explaining an emergency session had been called for tomorrow evening to address the chairwoman's arrest and determine next steps for organizational leadership. The tone was professional but urgent. They were requesting my input on any concerns I had about HOA governance moving forward. I read it twice, considering the implications. This was an olive branch, a recognition the old leadership that crossed lines that couldn't be ignored. But it was also a test, seeing whether I'd use the situation to push for revenge or reform. I drafted a measured response. I appreciated their outreach. My only concern had ever been clear boundaries regarding properties outside HOA jurisdiction. I had no interest in influencing internal HOA governance or policies that didn't affect my land. If new leadership respected legal property boundaries, we'd have no conflicts. I hoped the organization would take this opportunity to review its enforcement approach and ensure future actions stayed within legal authority. Professional, firm, not threatening. I sent it and marked the sender as a contact worth monitoring. The rest of the day passed in a strange quiet. Snow continued melting under afternoon sun. My security cameras recorded nothing but birds and wind-blown branches. No cars drove slowly past my house. No one appeared at the property line taking photographs. The absence of harassment felt almost disorienting after 8 months of constant low-level pressure. I kept expecting another legal letter or social media post or HOA violation notice. Instead, nothing, just silence and space and the peculiar peace that comes after a long-fought boundary finally gets enforced. Evening brought one more significant call. The deputy district attorney assigned to the case introduced himself and asked if I had time to discuss prosecution strategy. I said, absolutely. He'd reviewed all evidence files, interviewed arresting officers, and examined the defendant's initial statement. His assessment matched my attorney's, an extremely strong case, clear intent, clear criminal action, clear documentation. The defendant's position as HOA chairwoman actually worked against her because it established motive for the trespass. She'd explicitly threatened to find evidence, then followed through by breaking into my property. Textbook premeditation. He expected her attorney would push for a plea deal to avoid trial. I asked what that might look like. He said probably 6 months probation, community service, restitution for any damages, and a permanent restraining order. Possibly a suspended sentence if her record was otherwise clean. The goal wasn't maximum punishment. It was accountability and deterrence. Making clear position doesn't grant immunity from law. I said that sounded reasonable. I wasn't interested in destroying her life, just in establishing she couldn't destroy mine. He appreciated that perspective and said it would make the case easier to resolve. We'd be in touch as things developed. After hanging up, I sat in growing darkness, thinking about justice. Real justice, not the revenge fantasy kind you see in films. Justice is boring. It's paperwork and procedures and measured responses. Its deputies reading Miranda rights in a snowstorm, and district attorneys discussing plea agreements, and judges reviewing restraining orders. It's not dramatic or satisfying in the moment, but it's reliable. It creates records that can't be undone by social pressure or community politics. It establishes precedents protecting the next person who faces similar harassment. The woman who broke into my cellar last night would face consequences, but those consequences would be proportional and legal. She wouldn't be physically harmed or publicly humiliated beyond the natural exposure that comes from being arrested for a crime. She'd go through a system designed to balance punishment with rehabilitation, and that system would send a message to everyone watching that authority has limits. I thought about the HOA board member who'd called threatening me this morning, who'd hung up when I mentioned adding him to the restraining order. He'd learned something today. Position doesn't protect you from repercussions when you make threats. I thought about the neighbors who'd called, expressing support, who'd said they'd been waiting for someone to stand up to the chairwoman's overreach. They'd learned something too. Standing up works, but it requires documentation and patience and willingness to let systems function. And I'd learned something myself, that the discipline I developed studying plant growth, the careful observation and record keeping and resistance to premature conclusions, translated perfectly to human conflict. Watch, document. Waits for the right moment, then act decisively within legal boundaries. No drama, no emotion, just consistent application of principle. The house was completely dark now, except for my desk lamp. Outside, temperature dropped again, refreezing melted snow into ice. My coffee had gone cold. I stood and stretched, feeling tension release from muscles tight since yesterday evening. The acute crisis had passed. What remained was process, the slow grinding of legal machinery toward resolution. I was fine with slow. Slow meant thorough. Slow meant getting it right. I turned off the lamp and headed upstairs, leaving security monitors running out of habit. Tomorrow would bring more calls, more emails, probably more community reactions. But tonight, for the first time in 8 months, I'd sleep knowing my boundaries were no longer theoretical. They'd been tested, violated, and enforced. And everyone involved now understood enforcement wasn't optional. It was inevitable. The emergency HOA meeting occurred 2 days after the arrest, on a Friday evening when roads had finally been cleared and people could gather without risking safety. I didn't attend. I wasn't a member, had no vote, no official standing in their organization. But I received a detailed account from the board member who'd emailed me, the one who'd extended that careful olive branch. She called at 9:30 that night, voice tight with what sounded like exhaustion mixed with relief. She wanted me to know what had transpired and said I deserved to hear it directly. 38 of 45 HOA members had shown up, highest attendance in years. The former chairwoman had not attended, citing advice from her attorney. Smart move on her part, though her absence made everything easier for those pushing for change. The meeting opened with a motion to remove her from the chairmanship, effective immediately, citing conduct unbecoming, violation of community trust, and criminal charges pending. The vote wasn't even close. 37 in favor, 1 abstention. No opposition votes at all. Even her closest allies had apparently decided defending someone arrested for breaking and entering wasn't a hill worth dying on. But the vote was just the beginning. What followed was something the board member described as a reckoning. Person after person stood to share their own experiences with the former chairwoman's overreach. A man fined repeatedly for offenses that predated HOA color restrictions. A woman threatened with liens over garden decorations, violating no actual written rules. A couple publicly criticized on social media for parking an RV in their own driveway for 3 days. Story after story. People who'd stayed silent during her reign because they didn't want conflict or didn't know they had legal grounds to push back. Now, with her authority stripped and her judgment publicly called into question by her own criminal behavior, they felt safe speaking up. The board members said it was uncomfortable to witness, not because complaints were unfair, but because they revealed how many had been quietly suffering under governance prioritizing control over community. Several members admitted they'd voted for policies they disagreed with just to avoid being targeted. Others said they'd considered moving rather than continue fighting HOA leadership. One elderly resident actually cried, describing how she'd been made to feel like a criminal for planting flowers in her own front yard without prior approval. The meeting, supposed to last an hour, stretched past 3. People finally feeling heard after years of silence. Eventually, the group moved to constructive action. They voted to establish a committee to review all HOA rules and enforcement procedures, ensuring everything aligned with actual legal authority and reasonable community standards. They voted to implement an appeals process for violations, something that had never existed. They voted to require any future enforcement action include specific citation of the rule violated and legal basis for HOA jurisdiction. Basic accountability measures that should have been in place from the start, but weren't because previous leadership operated on assumption of unchecked authority. Then came the vote I'd been most curious about. The board member who called me had proposed a formal apology to me for harassment endured, along with written acknowledgement my property fell outside HOA jurisdiction and would never be subject to their rules. She said the vote on that measure was unanimous, 38 in favor. They were drafting the letter tonight and would send it certified mail tomorrow. She wanted to know if I'd accept it. I told her I would, with appreciation. I'd never wanted to be at war with neighbors. I just wanted boundaries respected. If this situation taught the community something valuable about limits and accountability, maybe some good could come from an ugly situation. We talked a few more minutes about next steps. The board was interviewing candidates for interim chair, looking for someone with actual HOA management experience rather than personal charisma and control issues. They were also consulting with an attorney, different from the one the former chairwoman used, to audit governing documents and ensure legal compliance going forward. The board member thanked me for standing firm and said my willingness to enforce boundaries had given others courage to speak up about their own concerns. I thanked her for reaching out and wished the organization well. The call ended on a note of cautious optimism, but not everyone in the community saw things so positively. Next morning, I found my mailbox knocked over during the night. Post bent, box dented, like someone hit it with a bat or drove into it deliberately. vandalism, petty but pointed. I took photos from multiple angles, noted time of discovery, filed a police report online. Then I set the mailbox back up and reinforced it with concrete. 2 days later, someone left a bag of garbage at the end of my driveway. More photos, another report. I didn't know if these incidents connected to former chairwoman's supporters or were random acts by people resenting conflict I brought into their quiet community. Either way, I documented everything and refused to be intimidated. The formal apology letter arrived a week after the meeting, professionally printed on HOA letterhead and signed by all current board members. It acknowledged enforcement actions against my property had been inappropriate and legally unfounded. It confirmed my land status outside HOA jurisdiction. It expressed regret for conflict and hoped we could move forward with mutual respect. I read it twice, then filed it with all other documentation. The letter didn't erase 8 months of harassment, but it created an official record I'd been right all along. Sometimes vindication is its own reward. Word of the arrest and community fallout spread beyond our immediate neighborhood. A local reporter called asking for an interview about HOA overreach and property rights. I declined politely, saying the case was still pending and I preferred to let legal processes conclude before making public statements. She understood, but asked if I'd reconsider after trial. Maybe, I said. Depends on how things resolve. She thanked me and said the story was important regardless. A lot of people dealt with similar issues, but didn't know they had legal recourse. I agreed that was true, then ended the call before she could press further. The preliminary hearing happened 3 weeks after the arrest, exactly as scheduled. I sat in the courthouse hallway 90 minutes waiting to be called, watching people flow past on way to various legal proceedings. The whole building felt like a monument to consequences. Every courtroom handling situations where someone crossed a line and society determined the price. Eventually, my name was called. I entered the courtroom, took the witness stand, swore to tell truth. The prosecutor asked me to describe what happened night of December 8th. I did, chronologically, factually, same as I told deputies and district attorney. Defense attorney cross-examined me briefly, trying to establish I'd somehow entrapped his client. I explained calmly, installing security systems on your own property isn't entrapment, and choosing not to assist someone committing crimes against you isn't illegal detention. The judge agreed. 20 minutes later, I was dismissed. I learned later that day, defendant had accepted a plea agreement. 6 months supervised probation, 100 hours community service, restitution of $2,500 for my security upgrades and legal fees, and a 2-year restraining order prohibiting any contact or approach. No jail time, no felony conviction, but a permanent record of criminal trespass and criminal mischief. The prosecutor called to inform me and asked if I found terms acceptable. I said yes. I'd never wanted her in prison. I just wanted harassment to stop and community to understand position doesn't grant immunity. This accomplished both goals. That evening, I stood on my back porch, looking out at the root cellar. Snow had melted enough I could see repaired outer door, new lock installed, everything secure again. In 3 weeks, that structure had gone from simple storage to crime scene to symbol. Symbol of what happens when authority overreaches. Symbol of what patience and documentation can accomplish. Symbol that boundaries properly defended hold. I thought about the woman who'd broken in there, who right now was probably meeting with probation officer and community service coordinator, beginning process of rebuilding a life she damaged through her own choices. I didn't hate her. I didn't celebrate her downfall. I just felt quiet satisfaction seeing a system work the way designed. Crime committed, crime reported, crime punished. Clean, legal, proportional. The community had learned its lesson. I've received no more violation notices, no more threatening letters, no more social media attacks. New HOA leadership operated transparently within clear legal boundaries. My neighbors, afraid to speak up, now felt empowered to question authority when it overstepped. And I'd learned something too, that skills I developed in my career, observation, documentation, patient analysis, had value beyond academic research. They were tools for protecting autonomy in a world where some people will always try to control what isn't theirs. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to surrender, refuse to be intimidated, and trust it. Law and evidence will prevail over bluster and position. Not always, but often enough to matter. Spring came early that year, snow melting by mid-March, temperatures climbing into 50s. I spent a Saturday afternoon in the root cellar for the first time since the arrest, finally ready to reclaim space from its brief identity as crime scene. Interior looked exactly as I'd left it before winter. Shelves lined with seed storage containers and gardening equipment. Everything organized, dust-free. No evidence remained of that December night, except the new electronic lock on inner door. Upgraded, more secure than before. I ran hand along concrete wall, feeling solid permanence. My grandfather built this to last, to protect what mattered. He'd done his job well. I'd come down with specific purpose. Spring meant planting season, and my collection of heirlooms feeds needed sorting and preparation. I pulled down containers, methodically checking labels and viability dates, separating what could still be planted from what aged beyond usefulness. Work was meditative, requiring attention but not intense focus, leaving mind free to wander. I thought about past 4 months, how dramatically things shifted since that night. Community felt different now, lighter somehow, like pressure released from a system running too hot, too long. The new HOA chairwoman had stopped by 2 weeks earlier, a retired accountant with no interest in power games or control. She'd introduced herself, explained she was doing courtesy visits to all neighborhood properties, including those outside HOA jurisdiction, and asked if I had concerns about community management. I'd invited her in for coffee. We talked an hour about reasonable governance, clear communication, importance of staying within legal authority. She agreed with everything I said. Mentioning previous administration's approach troubled her years, but she'd never felt empowered to challenge it. Now, with fresh leadership and reformed policies, she hoped to rebuild trust. I believed her. Time would tell if belief justified, but initial signs positive. The restraining order had done its job. I'd seen former chairwoman exactly once since plea agreement, driving past my property on Main Road, but not slowing, not looking, just passing through like any resident. The 2-year restriction felt almost unnecessary now. She had lost position, reputation in community, presumably any appetite for further conflict. Last I heard, she considered moving to different state, starting over somewhere her mistakes weren't public record. Part of me felt sympathy for that. Mistakes should have consequences, but consequences shouldn't be permanent exile. If she learned from this experience, if she genuinely understood where she went wrong, maybe relocation was right choice for everyone involved. I finished sorting seeds, carried viable containers upstairs, planning tomorrow's garden layout. Property had good southern exposure, excellent soil, enough space to grow more varieties than I could possibly use myself. I've been thinking about that surplus lately. What to do with heirloom seeds and vegetables I didn't need. The new HOA chairwoman mentioned a community garden project open to anyone in area, regardless membership status. Maybe that was way to turn something positive from all this conflict. Share knowledge, share resources, build actual community instead of forced compliance. I made mental note to reach out about it. Evening found me on back porch with coffee, watching sunset through pine branches, finally showing Green Grove. Same view I'd had that December night, but transformed by season and circumstance. Then I've been watching crime unfold. Now I was just watching spring arrive. The shift felt symbolic in ways I didn't want to overanalyze. Sometimes peace is just peace, not metaphor or lesson, just simple absence of conflict. My phone buzzed. Email notification from my attorney. The restitution payment had cleared. $2,500 deposited into my account that morning. The financial aspect of case now closed. I'd broken even on security upgrades and legal fees, which was better than many manage defending their rights. Email included final note. Restraining order would remain in effect another 20 months unless circumstances changed. If I had any concerns or incidents, contact him immediately. Otherwise, he considered matter resolved and wished me well. I sent back brief thanks and closed email app. Resolved. That word carried weight. 4 months ago, resolution seemed impossible. Conflict felt permanent. Endless cycle of provocation and defense with no clear endpoint. But that's nature of boundary disputes. When one party refuses to acknowledge boundaries exist, they can't be resolved through compromise because there's nothing to compromise. Either property rights matter or they don't. Either jurisdiction is real or it isn't. Either law means something or it doesn't. I'd chosen to believe in all those things. And that belief had been validated. Not instantly, not dramatically, but through slow, patient application of principle. The system worked. It required documentation and endurance and willingness to see things through, but it worked. I thought about writing something, maybe account of what happened and what I learned. Not for publication, just for myself, organizing thoughts, preserving details while still fresh. But more I considered it, less necessary it seemed. I'd already documented everything that mattered. Video files, legal records, emails, photos, timelines. The story existed in those archives, available if ever needed again, but not requiring narrative embellishment. What I'd learned couldn't be reduced to simple lessons anyway. Every situation different, every conflict unique factors. The only universal truth: boundaries require defense, and defense requires preparation. Everything else context specific. Sun dropped below tree line, painting sky orange and purple. Temperature started falling immediately. Spring evening, still cold this early season. I finished coffee and stood, ready to head inside. But I paused at door, looking back at my property one more time. 5 acres, pine forest, and open land and heritage structures, built to last generations. My grandfather's legacy, my responsibility, my home. It had been tested these past months, invaded, violated, defended. Now it was simply mine again. Peacefully, legally mine, with clear documentation, protecting against future challenges. Boundaries aren't walls, they're foundations. They don't separate you from community. They define where your autonomy ends and others begins. When boundaries respected, communities thrive. When violated, everything breaks down into conflict and resentment, and eventually legal action. I tried to explain that to former HOA chairwoman before things escalated. She hadn't listened. Now she understood, though education cost her dearly. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Some people have to learn through consequences because incapable of learning through conversation. For those people, patience isn't weakness. It's preparation. And preparation, when the moment comes, is everything. I walked inside and locked door behind me, security system armed automatically. Cameras recording empty property under darkening sky. Somewhere in state, a woman serving probation, doing community service, paying price for believing position mattered more than law. Somewhere nearby, community learning to govern itself without intimidation or overreach. And here in the house built before any conflict existed, I'm learning to live peacefully again after months of necessary conflict. Not celebration, not triumph, just peace. The kind of peace that comes from standing firm when tested, from refusing to surrender rights because defending them difficult, from trusting systems designed to protect autonomy will do their job if you give them proper evidence. Tomorrow, I'll plant seeds. Next week, I'll reach out about community garden. Next month, I'll probably forget to check security cameras because nothing threatening happening. Life will continue, quieter now, simpler. The way it should have been all along. The way it will stay, as long as boundaries remain clear and respected. And if anyone ever tests those boundaries again, well, I have documentation protocols ready, legal team on retainer, and patient certainty that comes from prevailing once by doing everything right. But I don't think it will come to that. Some lessons, once learned publicly enough, don't need repeating. The community understands now. Authority has limits. Property rights are real. And the quiet man with the old house and heirloom garden isn't someone to underestimate. Not because I'm dangerous, but because I'm prepared. And preparation, in the end, is the only defense you ever really need. P, 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 P.